My introduction will be in English. The discussion will be in English and Czech, because if somebody is attending and they understand English but don't feel comfortable speaking in English, I will translate. Also, well, it does not really apply to anyone who is here, but I wrote it on my list of remarks. Please make sure that your Zoom usernames are real so that we know who is attending and maybe asking questions. At the Q&A, please raise your hand, like your digital hand, not your hand on the screen, and I will unmute you. The advantage of having the raised Zoom hand is so that I see the order in which you have raised your hand. If you absolutely do not want to speak on Zoom, write your question into the Q&A and I will read it out loud. The event is being recorded and we will post it later on the YouTube channel of the Společnost pro queer paměť. And now about Dr. Huebner. Dr. Karla Huebner is professor of art history at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Dr. Huebner's pronouns are she, her, and they. Huebner's research focuses on Czech modernism, feminism, gender, surrealism, and visual culture. Her book, The Magnetic Woman, Toyen and Surrealist Erotic, that came out with Pittsburgh University Press in 2020, was awarded the book prize of the Czechoslovak Studies Association for 21. I see here Dr. Justino, who I believe was on the prize committee, and I want to quote one wonderful quote from the beautiful award, and I quote, "Confronting a subject that is notorious difficult to investigate, Huebner's work is path-breaking and polished, not only delving deep into the surrealist world, walls of Prague and Paris, but in discussing head-on the still under-researched queer, trans, and feminist dimensions of modern Czech history." End of quote. Dr. Huebner will speak for about 25 minutes. I will pose a question or two, and then we will open it to public, and we will be done by about 7:45 Central European time, 6:45 British time, and, you know, Karla, you can say whatever time it is on the East Coast.
I guess that would be 12. Let's see, I'm losing my time now.
It will be done in 75 minutes, basically.
Yes, that sounds right.
If you haven't entered by now, you will not enter because I will make Dr. Huebner now the host and she will be giving a talk, so she cannot be admitting you. I will admit one more person. So at this moment, I will remove my spotlight and I will make Dr. Huebner. Okay, Karla, how will I make you? Okay, wait. More. Make host. Now you're host and the floor is yours.
Tak. Dobrý večer, dobrý den, a tak dále. Welcome everyone. I know many of you, and I'm pleased to see all of you, whether I know you or not, from other parts of my life. So again, yeah, I'll be speaking in English, and because I don't get to practice my spoken Czech very often, so I'm, especially after the pandemic. So I'm going to share my screen now, and that's going to take a moment. No. All right, can everyone see that? Okay, great. All right, wonderful. Okay, so I think many of you are familiar with the Czech surrealist Toyen to some extent, but some of you will be more familiar and some of you will be less familiar. And of course, this is a talk where we're thinking a little bit in particular about some of the gender and queer aspects of Toyen as an artist and as a member of the Prague Surrealist group. And so we've talked about pronouns in that Anna Hájková has given her pronouns and given pronouns for me. I'm going to be using she and her for Toyen, and I want to explain why, because there's been a certain amount of discussion about that in recent years. Certainly there are a lot of people that are active in the trans community that would like to claim Toyen as trans, and I can certainly understand that desire. There is also the fact that Toyen, as a Czech speaker, used the masculine form of the Czech language. And so there are definitely many people who believe, not without reason, that it makes sense to refer to Toyen as he or him. But what I've found is that Toyen's friends referred to Toyen in the feminine. And I think that if Toyen had really objected to this, Toyen would have let them know. And so while I think that we can think in terms of that Toyen might have done some things differently if Toyen were alive today in the current situation, in terms of gender identities, gender fluidity, and so forth. Things were very different when Toyen was alive, even though Toyen lived up to 1980. You know, it's possible that if Toyen were alive today, Toyen would identify as trans, but we don't know that. Toyen lived at a time when it was possible to have gender reassignment, or we might, you know, refer to it differently as gender affirming surgery. Yes, it wasn't done as well then as it is today, but I have no evidence that Toyen sought out, you know, such interventions to affirm a masculine gender. And so I feel confident that while it's very likely that Toyen would today use a neutral pronoun such as they, I'm going to go with the pronouns that, the feminine pronouns that Toyen's friends used. So I hope that's clear, not too controversial. I'm not, you know, intending to, you know, suggest that Toyen might not have been trans. We just don't know. Toyen does not seem to have given an opinion on that. But so to give a little background on the artist, and I want to make sure that since not all of you are as familiar with Toyen, I know that there are some old friends and relatives in the audience for whom Toyen is probably rather new. I'm going to be showing you quite a few different examples of Toyen's artwork and kind of take us mostly chronologically through some of Toyen's artwork and show a little bit, but not very much, by people that Toyen was associated with. And so you'll get kind of a sense of the different ways in which Toyen was working with, on the one hand, a lot of different media. Toyen was a painter, but also a draftsman or draftsperson, also worked in collage and printmaking. Those are kind of the main media that Toyen used. Toyen did not write. Toyen did not like to write. Toyen liked to read. So Toyen very much enjoyed reading poetry and being friends with poets, but there is very little written material left by Toyen. It's mostly kind of signing her name to postcards that were signed by other people. So there's not a lot of written evidence from the artist herself. And so early on, oh, and I should point out that in addition to my book, which came out in 2020, I would also recommend for people that are interested, there's been a major Toyen retrospective that opened in Prague last year, which I was lucky enough to be able to go and see, that then moved on to Germany, is moving right around now, I think, to Paris. And there was talk prior to the pandemic about it going to Chicago, and I don't know if that is still going to happen. But over on the right, you are seeing the English edition of the catalog for that exhibition. And I think the two books work very well together in that my book covers more of Toyen's life in her time in Czechoslovakia, is really emphasizing giving the Czechoslovak context for the artist and for the avant-garde groups to which she belonged, which is something that is mostly not known to Anglophone readers, even though it may be relatively familiar to people in the Czech Republic. And The Dreaming Rebel, the catalog, focuses a bit more on Toyen's life and work in Paris, where she moved in 1947. So both books cover the kind of the entire life, but each one has kind of its own emphasis. And the catalog has essays by quite a few different people, and so it's a nice scholarly work, very useful. And I think, yeah, if you love the work of Toyen, you should definitely have both books. And so that said, so here we have a couple of photographs of Toyen as a young person. I don't have a date on the one in which Toyen is wearing a skirt, but it's clearly from the 1920s, judging by the style of the costuming. And the photograph over on the left, where Toyen is wearing coveralls, is from about 1925. So they're around the same time. And this is something to be aware of. We often hear about Toyen as someone who often wore masculine styled clothing, and that along with the use of the masculine, not just pronouns, but the masculine forms of the Czech language, that these are arguments for Toyen to be considered masculine. And certainly Toyen did go back and forth between wearing clothing that would have been considered feminine and clothing that would have been considered masculine. Certainly when we're seeing the coveralls over on the left, these are obviously work clothes, very useful clothing to be wearing when painting and, potentially splattering paint and working with paint. Toyen and her first artistic partner, Štýrský, used quite a few different techniques, some of which did involve splattering paint onto the canvas. So yeah, good to be carefully dressed for that kind of activity. But in press photos and so forth, you normally see Toyen wearing dresses and skirts and so forth. So clearly Toyen was going back and forth between what was useful, what was fashionable, what presumably appealed to her at a given moment for a given occasion. And here we have a couple of early examples of Toyen's work. Toyen's artwork went through quite a few different stages and different looks. The work that we're seeing over on the left that has a title that is sometimes translated as oddball or weirdo, something like that. We can perhaps think of as a little bit of a self-portrait. It's someone who's clearly holding a palette in one hand, that circular form or half circular form over on the right of the painting, and that kind of short hair. On the other hand, we've got this real strong cubist and purist influence in terms of the style. And then very shortly after that, and that's a painting from 1923, which is the year that she and her friend Štýrský joined the avant-garde group Devětsil in Prague. Very shortly after that, Toyen began working in a quite different style, the more primitivist so-called style that we see over on the right, where there's a lot of emphasis on kind of a childlike, playful quality. And this works along with some of Karl Teige's theoretical ideas around that time for the Devětsil group about poetism and enjoyment of life and the pleasures of circuses and fairgrounds and going to the park with your sweetie and so forth, that we're supposed to balance workaday constructivism. Karl Teige was kind of the main theorist for the Devětsil group, and he became one of the major theorists for the Prague Surrealist group. So Toyen also very early on began to explore erotic modes of expression. And this is a really early work. And as you can see, it's an orgy scene. So something that I don't think Toyen would have been showing very many people. at the time that it was done, certainly not exhibiting it publicly, but Toyen was already in 1922 exploring various forms of sexual expression and kind of working from what we might think of as sort of a voyeuristic perspective. So you can see that these are basically heterosexual couples in quite a few different positions. So Toyen's definitely experimenting with this. Now, in the mid-1920s, Toyen and Štirsky were able to go to Paris, and they stayed there for about 3 years. A lot of the work that Toyen did there was various kinds of, just sort of private sketches and sketchbooks of things that she saw, places that she experienced. This is a period when what were known as reviews. So we might think of, very elaborate productions with showgirls and, fascinating costuming, but often a lot of nudity. Those were very popular in both Paris and Prague and various other cities as well. So, like think of Las Vegas showgirls, that's in that same tradition. And so it's clear that Toyen was really interested in a lot of these productions. It also appears that she may have gone to smaller scale places that may have been strip clubs, things like that. I suspect that the sketch titled 32 Poulet is depicting something like that. This seems to be an address. I wasn't able to find out exactly what was going on at this address in the mid-1920s, but it doesn't seem to have been the home of any kind of major entertainment. It seems to be more of a kind of an apartment building. So lots of sketches, but also she was doing a lot of painting. And so here we have a couple of her oil paintings from this period in Paris, when she's exploring what Paris is like, discovering different things. She's still working with this kind of primitivist style, emphasizing in many of her works pleasure, but again, also not shying away from things that are kind of sexually charged. If you'll notice on the painting over on the left with the dancers, there's that empty chair, and underneath the empty chair is where she signed her name. And then there are these male figures holding the flowers and everything. So she's kind of saving herself a little seat with these male or at least masculine looking figures. We don't necessarily have to assume that they are male. They could also be, women dressed in a masculine style. That was certainly something that was quite popular in the 1920s, to have a more masculine style in women's clothing. So I think we can leave that as an unknown. And the painting Bound to Unbound appears to have originated from a street performance that she saw. There are a couple of versions of this, one of which has kind of other figures in it, that one that looks like a sword swallow or something like that. So it's a little bit more in the circus realm, and at the same time, it does kind of suggest, hint at the idea of sexual bondage, etc. So I think it's a good example of some of what she's doing in the mid-1920s. Now, in terms of financial support, it appears that Toyen and Štirsky in the 1920s were probably really supporting themselves in Paris, largely by doing book design and illustration for publishers back in Prague. And they did some of these as collaborative projects, and some of them were solo projects. So these are a couple of examples of book covers that they did as collaborative projects. You can see that there's, definitely some Cubist influence, but also definitely some Dadaist influence in terms of the style of the collage. You'll notice the tiny head on the woman to the right, very much similar to what the German artist in the Berlin Dada group, Hannah Höch, was doing with putting together things that were very much out of scale in terms of body parts. So they're definitely aware of a lot of different things that are going on in the larger artistic and design culture at this time. For those of you that are not familiar with Czech, the book on the left with the blue and grayscale cover could be translated as the whirling stage or the rotating stage. This is a theoretical text by the future surrealist Jindřich Honzel, theater director, also a member of the Prague Linguistic School. And the cover over on the right, Lady at the Fountain, is a novel. Now, by 1926 and 1927, as you can see, both Toyen and Štýrský have gone in a really different direction artistically, and they've gone to pretty strong abstraction. They are working with lyrical, unusual methods of working with their paint. So they're working with spraying their paint. They're working with, putting grit and probably sand and possibly toothpaste and things into their paint to get interesting textures. So this is something that they do for several years. So this is the work that they're doing at this time. They really started a two-person art movement that they called artificialism. So that's what they're doing in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And Toyen's also doing these, very, very sensitive, moody kinds of drawings around this time, starting to do a lot of book illustration. And by 1930, they have both moved back to Prague, and they're really starting to kind of make a splash in the local artistic scene. Their friend, the caricaturist and writer and later on diplomat Adolf Hofmeister, caricatured each of them for the arts magazine Rozpravy Aventina. I'm going to admit a couple of people who have appeared on my screen. All right, I think I've admitted both of them successfully. All right, welcome to our new people joining the talk. So this is Toyen and Štýrský in 1930, done by the caricaturist and writer Adolf Hofmeister for the arts publication Rozpravy Aventina, or Aventinum Discourses, which covered visual art, theater, music, dance, literature, really interesting, lively publication. And you can see that Hofmeister is showing Toyen in quite an interesting way in terms of gender identity, that Toyen is shown, wearing trousers and casting this shadow that is kind of partaking of the animal kingdom. So with fish and the bird and this almost like tiger striping patterning on the bodice of the dress. And then with that drafting triangle for an arm. So, Hofmeister is showing her in quite an interesting way. And again, for those of you that are not familiar with the Czech language, Hofmeister is also playing with gender in this. The Czech language has masculine, feminine, and neuter. And the words ten, ta, and to are the masculine, feminine, and neuter for, that. So he's giving us ten, ta, to, yen as this maybe masculine, maybe feminine, maybe neuter person. So very playful, very clever. And Štýrský as a somewhat melancholy figure is over on the right. And these two artists during Štýrský's relatively short life were very close friends, exhibited together, do not seem to have been romantically involved, but they definitely had a very close partnership. All right, now, there. And there we have them in a photograph from one of their shared exhibitions, and that's a painting by Toyen behind them called Sea Anemones. This is still from their artificialist period. And you can see that Toyen is, dressed in a skirt, but in perhaps a slightly more masculine style of skirt. Oh, and I've got another person to admit. Okay. Right. So I mentioned that both Toyen and Štýrský are supporting themselves quite a bit by doing book design and book illustration. These are just some nice examples of the quite varied forms of book illustration and design that Toyen was doing for different Czech publishers. She worked for some of the major Czech publishers of the period, but also for various small presses and kind of private presses. So quite a variety of different sorts of things. She did a lot of illustration for volumes of poetry, but also for novels, also for children's books. She was very well known for her children's book illustration, and this is one that is probably her most famous children's book, Náš svět, Our World, where it's showing various different things about the modern world in relationship to children. And then she also, in the early 1930s, was doing quite a bit of erotic illustration, some of which is just stuff from her sketchbooks, and some of which she was working up more into finished kinds of works. So some of these were published in Štýrský's erotic journal called the Erotická review, or the Erotic Review. And you can see that they involve both heterosexual and same-sex encounters. They often have phallic imagery. They can be quite playful. I'd say they're more often playful than disturbing at this period. But so these are some examples of the work that she's doing in terms of erotica at this time. And some additional examples with the one on the right and the one on the bottom left. You can see that even though she's not yet a surrealist at this point, she is definitely moving in kind of a surreal direction. She was certainly aware of surrealism, just not a surrealist in the early 1930s. Definitely thinking about gender ambiguity or gender bending kinds of things. And so then in 1934, a number of the Prague avant-gardists, most of whom had been in the Devětsil group in the 1920s, decided that they were interested in forming a Prague surrealist group. And so these are the major founding members and the two major members that joined soon after the founding of the group. There are some other members that really never did anything with the group. But as you can see, you have writers, you have visual artists, you have the theater director, Jindřich Honzel, whose book cover we saw a moment ago, the jazz composer Jaroslav Ježek. So quite a range of different people involved in the group. And Toyen was quite active in advocating for beginning this group. The writer Vítězslav Nezval was kind of maybe the most active person in forming the group, but Toyen was definitely there handing out leaflets and going to speak with different art groups and so forth. So that's kind of interesting in terms of that later in life, Toyen was not really out there in the public that much, but mostly hung out with members of the Paris Surrealist group. And so here we have photos of Štýrský, Toyen, Nezval, and the theoretician and art historian and architectural theorist Karl Teiga. So by the time that Toyen and Štýrský and these other creative figures are forming their Prague Surrealist group and getting in touch with the Paris Surrealists, Toyen and Štýrský have moved on from artificialism. They're doing work that relates to artificialism, but has some new things behind it. So stylistically, this is kind of what you see Toyen working with, lots of cracking and fissuring, some paint that looks kind of drippy, still very interested in texture, interested in phantoms and ghosts and, kind of mysterious, creepy figures that often don't have heads or faces. And so the French surrealists come to visit, not all of them because there were too many of them to all come and visit, but André Breton and his wife, the painter Jacqueline Lambat, came along with the poet Paul Éluard, and they were accompanied by the Czech painter living in Paris, Josef Šíma, who's over on the right in the left-hand photograph. And so the Prague Surrealists gave them a very nice time, took them out to Karlovy Vary and to Brno, and I'm sure other places as well. And then soon thereafter, several of the Prague Surrealists went to Paris, Štýrský and Toyen, as well as Nesval. So they're meeting up with the Paris Surrealists again and meeting more of them. Unfortunately, at that point, Štýrský succumbed to some very difficult health situations and was in the hospital, nearly died, but did recover. And so in a lot of ways, this was a pretty momentous time for both groups of surrealists. It's also when the Paris Surrealists really ran into a lot of difficulties with the Communist Party. So politically, it's a difficult time. And then back in Prague, Toyen is venturing a little bit into collage with these works for a publication that the Prague Surrealists did called Ani Lábuť, Ani Luna, which is relating to the Czech Romantic era poem Maj, major Czech Romantic work, but this was at the centenary of the poet, and they were getting a little bit sick of all of the celebratory hoopla around this centenary, so they put out their own not so quite entirely celebratory look at the poet and Maj. And we can think in terms of Toyen's collages at that time as in terms of their relationship to what other surrealists were doing with collage. Štýrský was definitely exploring collage quite heavily in the mid-1930s. He was working with a lot of colored imagery, a lot of medical and religious imagery in his collages. You can see that Toyen was more working with what we would refer to as xylographic collage, so collage from 19th century woodcuts, such as Max Ernst in Paris was making quite famous with his collage novels like Une semaine de bonté, A Week of Kindness. And as I mentioned, Toyen is doing a lot of works where you have these sort of mysterious, ghostly, haunting figures, particularly possibly female. Of course, when you just have a coat, the gender is a little mysterious, but these are a couple of nice examples of the work from that period. And then as we get to the very difficult period of the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, and of course then into World War II, Toyen is not doing so many paintings, but working much more in terms of drawing and printmaking, and did some major series at this time. These are a couple of examples of prints that Toyen was doing. This is a series called The Shooting Range. And during this period of occupation in World War II, Štýrský died. And meanwhile, a newer member of the Prague Surrealist group, Jindřich Heisler, had become close friends with Toyen. He's her second artistic partner. And he was also of partly Jewish descent. And so Toyen was one of the people that helped hide Heisler from the Nazis. So he lived in her bathroom for a time, and they did some collaborative projects. And this is really when he began to explore working in photography and visual art, although he was still a literary poet, but ended up becoming primarily a visual artist, because when the two of them moved to Paris in 1947, there were not a lot of people that that were in Paris that could read poetry in Czech. So this is a book that they did that was really not much like anything else that they did. It's putting together dioramas and photographing them and combining them with poetry, and really quite an interesting work. And as I mentioned, Toyen's not doing a lot of painting during this period, but Toyen did do some painting. And you can see again these changes in style, that there's this more what we would refer to as a veristic kind of style, where it's more believable looking in terms of closer to a photographic looking sort of image. And at the same time, you'll notice that there are some very, very surreal things going on. The feet that are vanishing into the wall, and the shadow that is holding the plant. And that is the silhouette or the shadow of Jindřich Heisler. And so with things going in a strongly communist direction after World War II and the liberation, even though Toyen and Heisler were definitely leftists and definitely interested in communism, they were very skeptical of Stalinist communism. And so they decided that it was better to move to Paris before things got perhaps too restrictive, as indeed they did. So this is a photograph from when they seem to have been packing up Toyen's paintings to ship to Paris. And so then they really, settle in with the Paris Surrealist group, go on vacations with André Breton and Benjamin Perret and other members of the Paris Surrealist group. This becomes their friendship group. And again, Toyen's work continues to develop and change. Lots of very mysterious looking themes going on, nonetheless, imagery that suggests body parts and sexuality. You can see these things that look like tongues in the center here. So, also a lot of animal imagery. So lots of really interesting different periods in Toyen's work. And again, with the Silence of Mirrors, this, very poetic, very swirling red dress image that we see in the center, but alongside what suggests perhaps a tree trunk, something like that, an animal image that suggests perhaps a bat, something like that. And so, and here we have a photograph that I took at the recent Toyen exhibition from last summer in Prague. These are 3 works from the series 7 Swords. And we'll look close up at the one on the right. This is a series of kind of phantom female figures. So often they're very phantom-like. You'll notice this phantom-like animal figure, this sort of feline, sort of over the top of the phantom, more human-like kind of ghostly figure. And Yeah, lots of really interesting phantom-like imagery with suggestions of body parts, genitalia, animal heads, animal parts, very, very interesting, mysterious, ghostly kinds of work in the 1950s and into the 1960s. So, these images that, look kind of like female genitalia, but aren't quite, or that look kind of like tongues, or that are, placed in the region of the genitalia, or, this is something that in a much less, explicit kind of way than in the early 1930s erotica. And lots of interest, again, in the female figure, in, again, body parts, relationship to animals. She's beginning to make a lot of use of collage in her oil paintings. So collaging pieces onto the oil paintings. So, for instance, we're seeing a portion of Bernini's statue of Apollo and Daphne over on the right. Yes, it's that time.
Well, yes, you've been talking since a while.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I think we've gotten close enough to the end of Toyen's career that we can definitely switch to the next part of the program. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll have discussion and Q&A.
Well, I did not mean to quite stop you so abruptly.
That's okay. That's okay.
But thank you so much. I have the book. I have listened to your talks before. I have known you, in fact, when you were in Prague as Fulbright Fellow. And yet I always learn something new. Now, also, I'm a historian and not an art historian, but also, if nothing at heart, I'm a deeply, profoundly pragmatic person. So I want to ask you, are there any plans to publish this wonderful book in Czech and make it, because the book, is out with an American publisher. It's not the most affordable of books, but I also understand that publishing art books in the Czech Republic is a little bit more affordable than in the US. So do tell us, we are very curious.
Yeah, there are not currently, plans in place to publish in Czech, but I own the rights to Czech translation. So I am very eager to see it translated into Czech. So I would very much like to be approached by a Czech publisher to arrange for a translation. Mm-hmm. My American publisher, University of Pittsburgh Press, has the other language rights, but I have the Czech rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also see, to my delight, Ladislav Jackson, who has written about your book and has written about the exhibition, and who is an art historian and who used to be a member of the committee of the Czech Society for Queer Memory. So I am very happy to see him here and want to give a shout out. And since Kate has very quickly raised her hand, I will pass on to Professor Giustino.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Karla. It was a wonderful talk. And it is indeed a wonderful book. One of the questions I wanted to ask was, how was the cover image chosen? And is there a message or an argument that you would like us, that you see represented in the cover image?
That's a great question. And I'm so glad to have a question about the cover. As those of you that have published books before know, the author doesn't always have control over the cover. I was asked to, give some indications of what I thought would be some, good directions for the cover to take. And for those that haven't seen the cover before, well, it looks like I'm showing this backwards, but what can I say? This is the set of images that were chosen for the front cover, and then we have paintings on the back cover. My suggestions for the cover were to use one of the more mysterious looking paintings. on the front cover and to go with a darker background. Clearly, that's not what happened. I think that the designer probably thought that the suggestions that I was giving were maybe not trendy enough, and that they were more suggestive of an earlier period in book publishing on surrealism. And so I have noticed that there has been a little bit of a trend for collage cover illustration in at least some books. And so the designer went with, working with collaging together some things that they found interesting. Now, originally, in the first design that I saw, instead of the image of the woman with the sort of monstrous tongue or whatever it is sticking out of her mouth, the artist had actually chosen an image by Štýrský that I thought looked really great. But I said, wait a second, that's not the right artist. And so then they went back and replaced it with this particular image. And I think there are pros and cons to this particular, cover. There are people that love this cover design. There are people that are not so crazy about it. There are things I like about it. There are things I'm not so crazy about it. I think that, on the one hand, it has a certain interesting shock value to it that will attract some readers. On the other hand, I think it, for the same reason, it could put off other readers. So, it's something I didn't ultimately have a lot of control over. But so I think the idea was to, come up with a design that was reflective of things that Toyen did, but at the same time, yeah, I think there are definitely other covers that could have been done. And, it's always hard to know exactly how successful a cover image is.
Could I just build on that a little bit? When I looked at the image the first time, I was also wondering if there was some messaging or some argumentation in that image. And I understand that it wasn't your intention to choose that image, but I mean, I was wondering if it suggested ways in which Toyen, given her identities, was constrained in expressiveness.
Mm-hmm.
So she's blindfolded. The tongue for me is ambiguous. I can't tell if it means that she's blindfolded, she can't see, but she has a big tongue so she can speak a lot in some way, or whether it's a swollen tongue or something else that's stopping speaking,
right,
stopping expression. So
yeah.
I looked at it as somehow suggesting possibilities or lack thereof for expression. And so my mind went, and again, intentionality is its own, special thing. My mind went to questions of constraints and possibilities about expression, particularly for women, particularly for a woman with mixed, perhaps frustrated gender identity in that context.
Yeah, I think you can definitely read it that way. Certainly, Toyen had a fair amount of, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a major theme in the work, but it's certainly not an unusual theme in Toyen's work of women that are constrained, that are tied up in some way, or blindfolded, or I mean, it's common enough that it is definitely a theme, even if it's not as big a theme as some of the other things that Toyen did. So I think that is certainly something that we could see there. In terms of that theme, I don't know that it's the image I would have chosen from the work, but I think I think you're right. It can work in giving that kind of a message.
I have more questions, but I see that Mirna, Dr. Šulić has questions before me, and I will give space to others. Mirna.
Anna, I can wait seriously if somebody has an urgent question. Oh, sorry, Kathleen, I'll be very short. Karla, nice to meet you. Okay, well, Karla, nice to meet you. Finally, I have tried to come to one of your book presentations now for a year. However, you know, it's a lot of going on. So anyway, greetings from Glasgow. I actually have a question for you. One of my PhD students now finally defended his thesis on representations of blackness in 1960 Czechoslovak cinema. So we looked into this topic in the history of Czech arts and literature and so on. And we had some heated discussions about Toyen as well. And I would appreciate your opinion. Do you think that her treatment of African art and Black figures is different from what we usually see in surrealism in, you know, the first Czechoslovak Republic and maybe more generally, especially because, you know, she dealt with these motives as a woman as well as somebody who is, you know, quite aware of her sexuality and perhaps gender issues? Sorry if my question is just very blunt, but I would really like to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think the issue of Blackness in Toyen's work and African identity is definitely something that we need to think about. It's something I didn't really address to any great extent in the book, and I know that there are I think Marta Filipova and various other people that might be here, you know, would have liked me to have done more on that, and I probably should have. But that gives an opening for other people. But I think that on the one hand, you know, here we've got this period when you've got both Africans and African Americans in Europe to a larger extent than previously, and the white Europeans are seeing them as exotic and exciting. People are very excited about Josephine Baker, for instance, that she's so sexy and that she's so funny, but at the same time very light-skinned. And then, you know, there's all that, you know, colonialist stuff about Africa itself. And on the one hand, as I'm sure you know, the surrealists were anti-colonialist, but I don't know that, you know, we can say that they didn't share in any of the, just as today, that, you know, even those of us that really want not to be racist find ourselves having potentially racist thoughts or, you know, or at least racial insensitivities. And I think that you get a lot of that during this period with people like Toyen and with other surrealists that, you know, they want to be, you know, they're anti-colonialists. They, you know, they want to see Africans and African Americans as, you know, truly, fully human. And at the same time, well, you know, they've grown up with what they've grown up with, and that they're going to have a certain amount of exoticization of Black people. And I think there, you know, we get Toyen working with this kind of sexualized image of particularly the Black female, but also Black men, that in the painting that I did not show, the one of the Africans in paradise, that, yeah, you know, everybody is having sex with everyone else in every possible way, and there's a lot of male on male sex, and as has been pointed out, you know, there's also a performance aspect to this, that, you know, they're, you know, some of them are wearing, you know, top hats and straw hats, and so there's this suggestion of it being a performance that's put on. And I think other people have thought about this in greater depth than I have, but I think your student is certainly right to be thinking about, you know, this exoticization of particularly the African in Czech culture in the 20s and 30s. I mean, you can think of Josef Čapek as well with his African king painting. So, I mean, it's problematic. You know, they're trying to break free from earlier colonialist and racist images, and they're not quite fully succeeding. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
No, totally, because I was really, I really wanted to hear from you. So thank you very much for such a detailed answer, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. And sorry, Kathleen, for jumping in.
I had failed.
I think Kate had probably just not taken down the raised hand.
Okay. More questions? So while our shy audience is thinking of more questions, I'm interested in the communists. And I know that you and Sean Kleiber, who you think were writing at the same time, Sean kind of dropped out of academia and went for much greener pastures outside of the neoliberal sausage machine that are our jobs. And I'm very happy for him, but I'm a little bit unhappy that his book did not come out. And as you know, my second project, or my third project that kind of queer Holocaust history has replaced, is a long-duress study of Czech communists. And I was very intrigued by the surrealists being lefty, but not communists, or not staying communists. And I wonder, how would you position them into this, yes, very eventful Czechoslovak 1930s in terms of a communist history? I mean, Chet Bryant, in his new book on Prague, has a communist chapter. And what do the Czech surrealists tell us about Czech communism?
I think in part they tell us that Czech communism was still rather fluid and varied in the 1920s and 30s. That, overall, it seems like the Devětsil group was, if not actually communist, pretty leftist. And various members of the group definitely were members of the Communist Party. Of course, then in 1929, you have that big upset with the Bolshevization of the party. You have people trashing each other over whether they're communist enough and all of that. But into the 1930s, and I'm totally with you on our shared regret that Sean is not in a position to, easily get his book out, because I think Sean did really fabulous work on researching the avant-garde and communism. And I hope that his book still can come out, but, by that time, you may supersede it with your newer research. I don't know. But he certainly, dug into archives that, well, to some extent, we both looked at archives that we looked at the Ladislav Stoll archive that was in the process of being cataloged. And, he had sweet talked his way into getting our access to it. I mean, we would just, get these, boxes of uncatalogued materials and go through and photograph stuff and write notes. And, more of it was useful to him than to me. But, it was absolutely, fabulous to have access to that. And I think Sean is a really splendid scholar, as well as a good friend of mine. But I think that, what happens during the 30s is that on the one hand, you have these avant-gardists, and I say a bit about this in the book, but I don't go into it in huge detail, but especially for those that haven't read the book, you've got leftists who either are social democrats, which is a very left-leaning party, or at least was at that time, or they are, members of the Communist Party or close to it. And at the same time, you've got, these more hardline communists in the party that are feeling that, oh, surrealism, ugh. Why do these people think they have anything in common with us and with the proletarian revolution and so forth?
Kluci z Karlína, kalínští kluci.
So the Karlín boys are and others. I mean, also communists in Paris as well. That in both places, the the people at the center of the local communist parties are just kind of like, who are these surrealists and why do they think they have anything in common with us? And they're just crazy and they're annoying and they're bourgeois. And so you've got this struggle going on between the surrealists in general and the communists, because the communists are mostly favoring socialist realism, and the surrealists are saying, but we want more, you know, we want a psychological realism. We want to have a revolution of the mind, as André Breton put it, that it wasn't just going to be a revolution of social class. And so, you know, you have them coming at it from very different perspectives. And so then that's also kind of what leads to the loss of Nezval from the Prague surrealist group, because as the Nazi threat is becoming stronger and stronger within Germany and then Austria, he's looking toward the Soviet Union, and he's not so worried about the show trials. He's thinking that they're necessary, whereas other members of the group are like, no, they're bad. And so then he's, you know, figures, well, I'm going to disband the group, and everyone else says, no, we're throwing you out. So then, you know, he very definitely, as do some of the members of the Paris surrealist group, chooses to hew the communist line and become a communist poet. I mean, Louis Aragon in Paris is one of the French surrealists that does this. Later on, Éluard does. So, yeah, I mean, it's very tricky. And Bohuslav Barok, one of the Prague surrealists after the war, is, you know, saying that, well, you know, I was a social democrat, I wasn't a communist, because he wants to distance himself with what he sees. I mean, I don't know if he actually had been a communist, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but he's definitely separating himself from the post-war communists. So it's really tricky, and I'll be really curious to see, you know, what your findings are for your next book. And,
well, the next book will be on queer Holocaust history, but you know,
well, I mean, this new project.
Yeah. I mean, I do want to say, in case Sean will watch this YouTube video, that I also kind of envy him for moving to greener pastures and leaving this kind of blood sausage factory that is our jobs. But are there more questions?
Bring on your questions. Do not be shy.
Maybe then I can share my last question, and that's a question that I always like to ask at book talks. So now you finished your book, and where would you like to see the scholarship go onward, building on your work and on your arguments? What do you see as lacunas, or what do you find the worthwhile lines of inquiry to be followed, the questions to be posed?
That's a good question. Well, as we were talking about earlier, I do think that more investigation into imagery of the other, whether that is African and African American or other types of other within Czechoslovak culture, is a fruitful area of exploration. I think, you know, some work is being done on that, but I don't know that it's, you know, a huge amount yet. But that's something that I think definitely could stand more exploration. I also think that there could be much more investigation into ways in which the interwar Prague surrealist group relates to other surrealist groups within Czechoslovakia. So, you know, on the one hand, how it gradually sort of morphs into the post-war group, but really doesn't end up having any of the same members, because Taiga dies, and everybody else has left or died. But then there are also, you know, these other kind of groups in the interwar period that are working in ways that are rather surrealist, but that they aren't really tied to the Paris surrealist group. So I think in terms of surrealist studies, that would be an interesting direction to explore. That I don't think there's been that much, or at least in English, that much on the post-war group, and really nothing, I think, on those other surrealist-like or surrealist similar kinds of groups. Because I mean, you have certainly there's been work in terms of in the French situation of groups that are similar to surrealism, like Donna Roberts's work on Le Grand Jeu, which I wish she would publish more of, but you know, and on some of these other groups. So that's one direction. Something also that I'm kind of myself being quite interested in is the kind of occult direction that surrealism takes after World War II. And research on occult surrealism is something that has, I think, really began about 20 years ago, and we started to see publications on it within, say, the last maybe 10 years or so. And I think for both French and especially Czech surrealism, this is definitely something that could bear looking into more intensely. I've done a little bit of looking into it. I gave one conference paper on Toyen and kind of the occult directions that her post-war work is taking for the International Society of the Study of Surrealism. But you know, I think there are quite a few different directions that this work can take, and also just looking more at the situation of women artists in interwar Czechoslovakia and gender politics. That you know, some very good work has been done getting this started, particularly by Martina Pachmanová, but there's plenty of room for more. So yeah, there are all kinds of things that I'd like to see more done on. And let's see, Mirna is saying, as someone with background in literary studies, I think it would be really great to explore links between literature and visual arts in the interwar period. There are so many of them. We usually treat visual arts and literature separately. Yeah, I agree. That's a really good comment.
Thanks.
And there are some younger scholars that are starting to work on some of that. One of my co-panelists on the Toyen panel at the International Society for Study of Surrealism did look at some of that, but I would like to see more of what she is doing. Yeah. Other questions in Czech or English?
Well, I did promise people that we will finish by 6:45 British time and 7:45 Czech time, and it's great to listen to a talk about a queer and feminist and outspoken artist, but it's even better to have dinner afterwards.
Yes.
Dr. Huebner, dear Karla, this was wonderful, and we are very grateful, especially since we are on a shoestring and we cannot pay you as much as you would deserve, but our gratitude is not measured in that. Thank you so very much. We will post this on YouTube. Thank you for coming, and have a lovely Wednesday afternoon in Ohio.
Thank you, everyone, and ask your libraries to buy the book, because they have budgets.
Bye, bye, bye.
Bye. Thank you all for coming.